My views on the quality of access of healthcare in Antigua and Barbuda. A lot of us don't get the privilege to go overseas. We're not funded by the government. Something happened and the only thing we can rely on is our medical hospital, but sometimes cannot provide the essentials for us and we will have to go overseas. So I think we should do a little bit more and have that type of access for a low-income family as well as our high-income family. The part that I like the most in the DNA health policy is making mental health care more accessible to everyone. Especially in these times, these uncertain times through this pandemic, a lot of our young persons between the ages of 18 and 25 have difficulties coping with this type of situation. So we need to focus more on mental health.
As an Antiguan, I would like to say that the options of finding housing and land in Antigua is extremely hard, especially for youths who have not been prepared for this. I do not believe that the country's needs are being met when it comes to housing. I appreciate the DNA's policy when it comes to housing because they look out for the little guy. When it comes to the subsidized housing plan, it's an amazing plan going forward. I think it takes the worry out of youths in an issue where they have to think about the next 20 years of their life in building a family. It gives you the option to even rent to own. I love that policy. Renting to own gives us the option to go into rent, but knowing our money is going somewhere. I think that it'll be an amazing outcome to the country, to our youths and the next generations to come.
Good evening. Good evening, Antigua and Barbuda, the region and the world. Welcome. Welcome once again to the National Consultation Series on COVID-19 and its impact on our societies and our people. This engagement, of course, is brought to you by the Democratic National Alliance. This is the second installment in the series, and tonight we will be discussing COVID-19 and its impact on constitutional rights and fundamental freedoms. A very packed topic indeed. I am, of course, Malika Parker, the chairperson of the DNA and your moderator for this evening's consultations. It is my pleasure. Before we begin, it is customary that we enter this discussion, of course, that you know that the Democratic National Alliance hosts this national consultation on the COVID-19 pandemic as a public service. It is intended to provide robust discussion and stimulate dialogue on the subject. The statements made should not be interpreted as representing the DNA policy in any way, and so likewise, the views and opinions as expressed by any panelist are those of the speakers and do not represent the views of the Democratic National Alliance. So with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, my people, tonight, it is time to talk. We, the DNA, we simply bring you the experts and we provide you with a platform, and you bring your thoughts, you bring your concerns and questions. And together we hope to conquer COVID-19. And so I am happy to introduce you to our panelists this evening. First, I wish to introduce you to Mr. Aaron Alexander. Mr. Alexander is a qualified boat captain of over 15 years with a boat master's license for regional voyages. He is from the beautiful island of St. Lucia. Tonight, though, he appears in his other capacities as a community activist and human rights advocate. He is the former president of the Ionola Council for the Advancement of Rastafari, ICA, in St. Lucia. He is also now the deputy chairman of the National Green Party in St. Lucia. He works with and supports a number of other local NGOs and CSOs in his country. Welcome, Alexander. We also have on panel Mr. Jomo Thomas, who is a lawyer by training and a former Speaker of the House of Assembly in St. Vincent during the period 2015 to 2020. Mr. Thomas is also an avid writer and journalist, focusing most of his work on the social and political landscape in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Welcome, Mr. Thomas. We also have with us tonight, out of Barbados, Mr. David Denney. Mr. Denney regards himself as a proud socialist and Pan-Africanist. He is a renowned social activist and trade unionist in his country of Barbados, and indeed in the region. Mr. Denney is currently the General Secretary of the Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration, a regional NGO whose activism spans as far as South America. Lastly, I am happy to introduce you to Mr. Warren Cassell, a familiar name, of course, in these parts. Mr. Warren M. Cassell is an attorney at law who practices in Montserrat and certainly here in Antigua and Barbuda. Mr. Cassell attended the University of West Indies, where he obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1998. He obtained his legal education certificate from Norman Manley Law School in 2000. In 2003, he graduated from the Golden Gate University in San Francisco, California, with a Master of Law in Intellectual Property, focusing on entertainment and sports law. His main law chambers is housed here in Antigua, where he practices in several areas, including constitutional, administrative, commercial, copyright, criminal, media, trademarks, entertainment, and intellectual property law. So we do have a packed panel that is diverse, but of course that is experienced and expert. I will now take you to our various panelists as I invite them to just give you some opening remarks as we begin tonight's consultations. I invite Mr. Aaron Alexander of St. Lucia to give his opening remarks.
Good evening to one and all viewing this program at this time and those listening, and good evening to my fellow panelists, and of course to Miss Sister Parker for being the moderator this evening. I can tell that we have a very decorated panelists here this evening, and I'm looking forward to the discourse. And as you indicated earlier, with my background of being an activist, you know, there are so many dimensions to some of the things that I would love to speak about this evening. And of course, the topic that we're focusing on this evening when it comes to constitution and fundamental freedoms. You know, this is something that is dear to my heart because being a Rastafari, I've always felt that Rastafari have taken the better end of the stick when it comes to our constitutional rights being observed and protected, where the Constitution speaks clearly to persons' freedom of religion and all those things. And yet, for the past half century, the Rastafari community have been brutalized, murdered, and all sorts of atrocities committed against us just because of our faith. So I'm very pleased to be part of this of this panel here this evening, to be one of the panelists, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Alexander. And I want to remind all of our panelists to just ensure that your mic is muted when you're not speaking, so that our viewers and listeners can have a perfect experience with us tonight. I now invite Mr. Jomo Thomas of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to provide us with brief opening remarks. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening to you, Malaka, and your colleagues in the Democratic National Alliance. Good evening to all of the people of Antigua and Barbuda. Good evening to fellow panelists. And good evening to all of those who will be listening to us wherever you are. As you were told, I am Jomo Thomas, and I am from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I think that the topic tonight, constitutional rights and freedom in these COVID times, is most opportune, it's most important. Never in my life have I had a situation as we are going through. Never in my life, and I've been around for a little while, have I had to sit and listen to people so cavalierly talk about ways in which people no longer have any rights, or constitutions don't mean anything, or that all of this can be easily brushed aside. I have been one who believe from the outset, and continue to believe to this day, that constitutions matter, and even where there are emergencies of whatever kind, the fundamental rights and freedoms that are enshrined in constitutions are solid, they are meaningful, and they cannot be easily pushed aside. And this is why I have stood up and spoke forcefully on a number of issues here in St. Vincent and across the region. I was attacked for saying that I didn't think that COVID was an existential threat, and I still don't think it's an existential threat. And as a consequence, I'm not saying it's not a serious problem, but it's not an existential threat. And as a consequence, the assaults which we are seeing on our constitutional rights and freedoms should not be, and I stand firmly on that position. But thank you for having me. I am hoping that as we go on, we can expound much more on these points.
Certainly, Mr. Thomas, thank you for that opening. Your first line was that you still believe that constitutions matter. And I thank you for that. I think we're going to be returning to that several times this evening. I now invite opening remarks from David Denney out of Barbados. Thank you.
Giving me the opportunity to participate in this very important regional networking conference for Caribbean people and the people of Antigua. David Denney from the Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration. I want to say that we need to discuss these issues in a very calm way, because the first thing we have to look at the whole historical background in terms of all of these Caribbean nations. And you know that we came out of a slave society, and many of our foreparents would have suffered at the hands of the slave masters. And to be honest with you, we have never really made any real changes, and most of these Caribbean countries have remained in a very dependent position on Europe. For instance, many of the countries are very dependent on tourism. The COVID-19 situation have created some very negative conditions for us. So how do we, as the Caribbean, deal with the situation? Because the only way we can go forward is by creating the conditions for our main industry, because sugar and banana is no longer our main industry in the region. And coming out of this COVID-19 period, we have to create conditions for us to continue with tourism, or we have to look for alternative industries for our development within the region. And I am saying this to say that we have to find a way, in a collective way, and not in a partisan way, for us to move forward. And that's my opening statement for tonight, because honestly, I want to be sincere and honest with myself, and I don't want to be seen to be partisan. I want us to be seen in the discussion as developing a path for Caribbean people out of this COVID-19 situation, and in a very honest way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Denney. Thank you for that charge, particularly at the end, already appealing for unity. You said that we need a collective path forward. I think we will discuss that tonight, the extent to which the impacts or the derogations from our constitutional rights and freedoms are driving us further apart, or if they're bringing us together. So thank you very much. I now invite Mr. Warren Cassell from Antigua, Barbuda, and Anguilla to join us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Parker, and good evening to you, Madam Moderator, and to fellow panelists. The viewing and listening audience, good evening as well. Let me first thank the organizers for allowing me the opportunity to be a part of this discussion and assist in answering some burning questions that persons may have. While I may not have all the answers, I can assure you that I will do my best to assist in provoking thought, and also for assisting my fellow panelists in driving this informative bus along this legal journey. The Constitution affords several rights: freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of the right to personal liberty, etc. But these rights are not, what should I say? They're not without limitations. They are limitations. The very document that has afforded us these rights has somewhat curtailed them. For example, there is freedom of expression, but of course, you cannot defame somebody. You could be sued in defamation. There is personal liberty. For example, Section 5 of Antigua's Constitution says that no person should be deprived of his personal liberty except in the following circumstances, and lists several exceptions to include where there is the execution of a sentence or an order of the court. So if you're sentenced to imprisonment, obviously you can't say that your right to liberty is being violated. And a very important exception, which of course, since the 80s, because the Constitution was in 1981, contemplated this situation when it says, except for the purpose of preventing the spread of an infectious or contagious disease. And then there is the general section in Section 16 of Antigua and Barbuda's Constitution that is also in other constitutions of the member states of the OCS and CARICOM, where it says that nothing contained or done by the authority of law or enacted by Parliament shall be inconsistent with Section 5. Not all the liberties, but Section 5. And Section 5 is again about personal liberty. And it says where the law authorizes the taking of measures during a public emergency that are reasonably justifiable. So that's the question. So it can be challenged. However, you have to demonstrate that it's not reasonably justifiable in dealing with the situation that exists. So there are limitations, and I am prepared to answer as best as I could any questions as it regards this topic of COVID and its impact on constitutional rights. Thank you very much again. I'm not hearing Malika.
Okay, I was muted. So I was thanking you. I was thanking you for giving us a little push off in laying out the constitutional framework concerning rights, and of course, amplifying the point that they are not without limitations. So let's talk. Since March 2020, governments around the region, including our government here in Antigua and Barbuda, sprang into action. The one thing on their minds was mitigating the spread of this contagion and to secure public health, to mitigate the public health risk posed by COVID-19. And so a number of measures were instituted. A lot of the non-medical related measures have caused a lot of social upheaval, discussion, and even displacements. So we've had lockdowns, we've had states of emergencies, curfews, and there are other restrictions. And we even went as far, of course, as we know, in all our islands to create COVID offenses. So let us start at the beginning very briefly and discuss the concept of the state of emergency and what that does to the constitutional rights and freedoms that we do have, and how much does a constitution matter in the context of a state of emergency. That is our jump off point tonight, and I will invite any of the lawyers to first push us off on this question.
Let me start by saying that the state of emergency permits, in the case of Antigua, as far as their emergency powers legislation, permits cabinet to make regulations concerning several things in terms of the means of communicating regarding food, liquor supplies, electrical, water, and power stations. It also can prohibit the restrict possession or use by any person of any specified article. It opens the door to allow cabinet to make regulations regarding electricity, power and water stations, etc., requiring persons to notify their movements, limit the movements, etc. The state of emergency is something that, although it can be extended initially, the legislation permits it to be for a period of 1 month or such longer period not exceeding 6 months as the House of Representatives may determine by resolution, etc. As I indicated earlier in my opening remarks, the state of emergency, it's critical. It is contemplated in the Constitution as far as the personal liberty is concerned, that it can be your liberty can be somewhat curtailed when in fact as Section 16 says, when in fact that there are measures being taken by the authorities in dealing with the situation that exists, right? But those measures must be reasonably justifiable. Now, as to whether or not, I don't think we have any pronouncement on whether or not the mandatory requirement for vaccination against COVID-19 is reasonably justifiable, and perhaps no one has moved the court to determine that question as yet. But it's a question that is well in issue.
Okay, thank you for that opening, Mr. Cassell. Mr. Thomas, I will invite your thoughts on the issue of the state of emergencies and the impact on the Constitution generally.
Yeah. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have not had a state of emergency, an actual declaration of a state of emergency. What the government did was to invoke a 1977 act, which is called the Public Health Act, and to say that through the Minister of Health, and in keeping with the proclamation of the World Health Organization, that a medical emergency has been declared, and that this would go on until the minister thinks or sees fit that that medical emergency is no more, and as a consequence can remove it. And that has been one of my fundamental difficulties with the way in which things have happened in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because our Constitution, Section 17, says that the Governor General may by proclamation, which shall be published in the official gazette, declare that a state of emergency exists for the purpose of this chapter. And it goes into talk about the declaration of war. And then the requisite question for us is that Section 17(2)b says that a public emergency has arisen as a result of the occurrence of any volcanic eruption, earthquake, hurricane, flood, fire, outbreak of pestilence, or of infectious disease or other calamity. Now, we believe this is what the government is going to, the outbreak of pestilence and infectious disease. But the government has not invoked the constitutional provision. And a number of us here are of the view that everything the government has done so far is unconstitutional, because it has not gone to that constitutional, the invocation of that constitution. So a lot of the positions here is that, oh, you know, we don't have to do that. We have, what we are doing is grounded in statutory law, it's grounded in common law, but the Constitution itself speaks to the way in which certain things should be done. So for example, the medical emergency has been declared since March of 2020. And the government has not gone back to Parliament to review or to extend that emergency, as we see across the region in a number of other CARICOM countries. And that isn't clear. But if the emergency that we are talking about, whether they call it a medical emergency or an emergency of the outbreak of pestilence or infectious disease, we believe it means the same thing. And therefore, they have to invoke the Constitution, and they have not done that. So you would have situations where people are told, you can't be on the beaches, you can't go to this place or that place. And that is coming from the understanding that the government passed a law, the government made a proclamation, which flies in the face of what the Constitution says, because the Constitution talks about it can be declared for up to a year, that you have to go back to Parliament and renew it, you can end it at a certain time. So that is the difficulty we have here. We have people's rights being assaulted, and we do not have in my respectful submission, the invocation of the proper constitutional mandate. So, for example, um, it is our belief that where risks are involved, there ought to be choices. But maybe I am getting ahead of myself and I really shouldn't go there just yet. But our brother made the point that whatever is being done must be said to be reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. And we also know that the constitutional law speaks to the fact that whatever health measures that are being promulgated by the government, whatever measures are being promulgated, those measures must reflect a certain necessity, they must reflect a certain reasonableness, they must reflect necessity, reasonableness, and proportionality. Yeah. And in many respects, what we are seeing across the region is governmental overreach. And to the extent that there are governmental overreach, I think we have to ensure that that does not happen, and we have to protest. We have to bring matters before the court, as I saw our colleagues in Antigua did, in Guyana, they did the same thing, in Barbados, they did the same thing. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. But just to be clear, though, Mr. Thomas, are you saying that in the proper constitutional procedure that you refer to in St. Vincent is what? That a state of emergency should be declared in order to have this prolonged, the overreach that you think is taking place? What is the correct constitutional procedure?
If we look at the Constitution of St. Vincent, the Constitution says that Section 17.2, B says that there should be a proclamation by the Governor General, once the Governor General is satisfied that the public emergency has arisen as a result of an outbreak of pestilence or infectious disease. And I don't see how you get around that by saying you're invoking the statutory law. Because as the example I give, the statutory law allows you, or the government is claiming that the statutory law allows the minister to declare the emergency and to say whenever it ends. But the Constitution itself says, for example, that where you are declaring such an emergency, you have to have 2/3 support of the Parliament. And here in St. Vincent, the government doesn't have 2/3 support of the Parliament. It also says that you have to do a whole series of things, that the House must pass a resolution with this declaration. None of those things have been passed with that kind of a majority here. And it's my respectful submission that unless you invoke the constitutional that constitutional provision, Section 17 of the Constitution, and it may well be the same section across the region, that you cannot properly do the things that you're doing, particularly where you are in any way at all moving against the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people. I think the celebrated Trinidadian Senior Counsel, Israel Khan, made that point, that where you are moving against people's fundamental rights and freedoms, and because those fundamental rights and freedoms are so critically important, you would want to do that with the overwhelming support of Parliament. And that is not the situation that we have seen here.
Correct. And we are going to discuss that, because the whole concept of the parliamentary check and balance on the executive itself, which is the cabinet, I think is a raging topic amongst our islands. I think parliaments have not met very frequently during this COVID pandemic, whilst all of these restrictions have been enforced. So I want to bring in Mr. Denney and certainly Alexander now, because even though I believe the people of the region understood and appreciate the need for a state of emergency in the beginning, when applying the test of reasonableness, I believe that persons are feeling that the state of emergency main purpose is to contain crisis. And having done that initially, I believe that persons are feeling that the prolongation of the state of emergency is not necessary, or that in itself becomes an abuse. Mr. Denney or Alexander?
Well, I can join you here as a social activist and a trade unionist. And I think that there was no need for any state of emergency. I think what you needed was for the state to enter into dialogue with the people through the trade union movement, social movement, religious organizations, or whatever. And what we should have done from as far back as 2020, we should have been able to identify families that would have social problems going into this situation. And we should have created the conditions for our people to gain some kind of, to participate in some kind of popular educational process in terms of dealing with this situation. And the state should have find some way to deal with the situation in terms of helping the poor and powerless people, okay, within individual Caribbean states. I think the idea of the state of emergency created a position of the lawmakers and the people then on the other side. And they have created some very, very bad conditions for Caribbean countries.
Yeah.
Because I felt that we could have dealt with these situations in a better way by dealing with it in a more social and in a more, and we could have dealt with it in a way where we work with the people through a popular educational program, and then we would be able to deal with the COVID-19 situation. Because when you look at it, Barbados only had about something cases or so when we had the country locked down. And every day we're getting over 300 persons now with the COVID-19, during this COVID-19 situation. And the country is not really locked down like the way it was locked down when we only had 43 cases over a 6 months period. Okay? So my thing is that locking down the country and coming with state of emergency is not the way to deal with these issues. I think these issues and problems can be better dealt with through a social understanding with the people, and the people will respond better. Because when you come with a state of emergency and people lose their employment, okay, when you come with that kind of hard-hitting way of dealing with a crisis like this, then you're going to create other problems that are going to affect the society. Okay, so my thing is that we have reached a stage where we must look at dealing with it through a popular education program with the people. And the only way you can do that is by using the social movement, whether it's churches, the trade union movements, political parties, or whatever, to help you to organize and to mobilize people so that we can deal with this issue.
Thank you. So got that, Mr. Denney. In your view, the measures are not reasonably justified, and quite frankly, you're of the view that the process, the approach is totally off, that it should not be a totally legalistic approach. So, Mr. Alexander, I'd really like your input here, because we also know that it is under the state of emergency and the creation of these emergency powers that they've also created offenses, COVID-19 related offenses. And there have been feedback from certain quarters of our societies who feel as though that they are getting the brunt of the enforcement. I don't know if that is your experience in St. Lucia, but I certainly invite you to share your experience on that.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I believe generally throughout the Caribbean, most of the islands have seen a great level of pushback when it comes to some of the measures that were instituted for the control of the whole pandemic. We know that when it comes to the Constitution, the St. Lucian Constitution, for example, Chapter 1 has about 17 sections. And under those sections, all these 17 sections is under a broader heading of fundamental rights and freedoms. And some of those fundamental rights and freedoms includes protection of right to life, right to personal liberty, right protection from slavery and forced labor, protection from inhuman treatment, protection of freedom of conscience, of expression, freedom of movement, freedom from discrimination, emergency powers, and declaration of emergencies, just to name a few. Now, in St. Lucia, we had a situation whereby the former government of the Alan Chasney administration, they did not use the Constitution, just as my good brother, I believe, from St. Vincent, Mr. Thomas, indicated, where the Constitution makes provisions as to how to handle those things. Because when you're dealing with people's fundamental human rights, you have to face the Constitution. But a lot of politicians choose to take a shortcut, so to speak, and they implemented a state of emergency. Then they implemented a COVID Prevention and Control Act. And you had even rebellions within the Senate of St. Lucia, where certain senators did not even show up to vote on the bill. And the government at the time, the Alan Chasney administration, they pretty much fast track, or what how would you say, they went to get persons and just swore them in for that particular sitting of the Senate just to pass the bill. So people became very skeptical, and people realized, well, there must be some kind of ulterior motives by those politicians who are behaving that way instead of using the Constitution. So all these things raised a lot of red flags for people not trusting politicians' words and not trusting government. And even my good brother from Barbados alluded to in his opening when he mentioned about coming from, we have a legacy of slavery where we've been lied to on so many fronts, that there's this deep-seated distrust in the medical fraternity and in governments and so on, that people, really look at things when there's a saying that where people say, you look behind the scenes, because some of the measures that were being implemented, some of the things that governments were doing, it was really, they were really overreaching, and people became very apprehensive, and you have all this vaccine hesitancy boiling out of that. So even when we look at the history, we know that history is replete with examples of where black and brown people have been taken advantage of and lied to with experiments and so on through the decades. Medical experiments done on black people and brown people without their consent and all those things, which is tantamount of inhumane treatment, So we in St. Lucia, we went through that process where the past administration, they came with the state of emergency rather than the declaration of an emergency or having the emergency powers enshrined in the Constitution to use that. They went down the road of having state of emergency declared. Then COVID prevention and control bill came forward, and then certain things became an offense if you breach the protocols. You had COVID wardens walking the streets, fighting with people, assaulting people if they were not wearing a mask. You know, so a lot of brutalization happened within that framework, and people, you know, became very apprehensive, and there was this kind of sinister atmosphere created by the politicians. So if we're going to deal with curtailing people's fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms, we must face the Constitution. The opposition at the time, the Central Labour Party, they were vehemently opposed to the state of emergency. You know, they declared that this is just a tactic by the government to suppress the opposition from going out there and do some campaigning, because elections was around the corner and all those things, you know, were in the air. So, you know, now that the Central Labour Party has assumed the reins of power, they have now revoked the state of emergency. And even now, the ex-prime minister is declaring that it is unconstitutional what they have done. So you have all this back and forth going on in this whole COVID situation, and it was just handled very badly. And we all know, even now, you hear in the medical fraternity has pretty much changed the narrative now. They are saying that we have to pretty much start treating COVID like a flu, and COVID is going to be around with us for a long time. So then it begs the question, why all these lockdowns, why this all this brutalizing of people for protocol violations, you know, why all this COVID and control and prevention and state of emergency? Why hadn't they used the Constitution, which gives you a time frame where you could have those the declaration of the emergency, and you have a time frame where you could either extend or it doesn't go past, I think, 12 months or something like that? Why didn't they use the Constitution? So coming from an activist point of view and perspective, you know, people have been talking about this, you know, from inception. It is not an existential threat to us, you know, when it comes to this whole COVID thing. And now they are realizing that, and the narrative that COVID will be around with us for a long time. So we have to learn to live with COVID like the common flu and dengue and chikungunya and all the others. So why even now try to mandate workplaces to ensure that the workers get vaccinated? People are losing their jobs if they don't take the jab.
So
you know,
let me jump in, Aaron, because you're right.
Yes.
I think we need to go. Having set the context of the state of emergency that is granting our governments all of these far-reaching powers, on the 17th of September, the government of Antigua and Barbuda mandated vaccination against COVID-19 for all public sector employees, with a few exceptions. There were general exceptions given for medical exemption. The process by which you had to qualify to get that exemption is another story. And there is an allowance for exemption on religious grounds. Now, since the 17th of September, our government has systematically extended that mandatory vaccination policy to now mandating vaccination in the private sector. So this is where we are. We in Antigua are still under a state of emergency, of course. So I would just like us to now get into this whole discussion of mandatory vaccinations and the legality of that and the impact on our constitutional rights and freedoms. Before I let you jump in, I just want to remind our viewers and listeners that we are encouraging their feedback. We look forward to their questions and their engagements with our panelists. So let us talk about now the mandatory vaccination policy. I think the Antigua and Barbuda government and the Vincentian government might be two such governments in the region with a similar policy. I don't think it has been enacted anywhere else, but certainly ours appears to be the most far-reaching. Please, I like to start with our attorneys because I think the legal discussion sets a good framework for us. Mr. Cassell or Mr. Thomas, I welcome you.
Please, Mr. Cattell, you can go.
What? Can you repeat the question, please, Madam Moderator?
The question is, the emergency, the state of emergencies have now set the stage for the imposition of mandatory events. what is the legal position in terms of mandatory vaccinations? Mandated vaccinations.
Well, the government has made it mandatory. The question is whether or not those regulations, and in particular, I think it's regulation number 16, because they're all numbered, and whether that is done according to law. Section 176 of the Public Health Act of Antigua, which is the parent legislation to the regulations, mandates that before the regulations become effective and valid, two things must happen. One, they must be approved by cabinet, and two, they must be confirmed laid in parliament. It is my belief that they were not laid before the parliament and therefore they are invalid. That is a question that has just been raised before the High Court in Antigua, and the determination of that issue is pending. That is fundamental because, of course, the law is very definitive and public authorities can only act in accordance to law. There's a famous line that says that a private citizen can do anything till the law says no, but a public authority can do nothing unless the law says yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Cassell. Mr. Thomas?
Yes. You are quite right, Madam Moderator. Both St. Vincent and Antigua are leading the charge as it relates to these mandatory vaccines. And I guess part of the reasons why they feel compelled to do it is that there's overwhelming hesitancy on the part of overwhelming hesitancy on the part of citizens in all of these countries. And because they're not getting the uptake that they want to get, they feel that what they must do is to cajole, to force people into doing what they believe they should do. You see, the way I look at it is that you cannot deny people their fundamental right to work or to operate, and in essence lock them out of the society, as all of these governments up and down across the world are doing. If you want to take people's fundamental rights, which is an essential part of our democracy, it seems to me, as I said earlier, concepts of reasonableness, necessity, and proportionality must be fundamental. And what they are doing must be minimally necessary if you're going to make an assault on people's rights to achieve the public health aim. Look, there was a case that was decided last month, and I want to read just a little part of that case. It was a labor case in Australia, and the labor board ruled 2-1 against allowing a lady who worked in an elderly care home. They wanted to take a flu vaccine, and she had made the point that, look, the last time I took one of these, I had serious problems. The board ruled against her, saying that they suspect that she's an anti-vaxxer, and they rule against her. But there was a vigorous dissent. In fact, the dissent was twice as long. The dissenting opinion was twice as long. But I just want to read a certain part of this because I think it's fundamental. The dissenter, a guy by the name of Lyndell Dean, and he says, research in the context of COVID-19 has shown that many who are vaccine hesitant are well educated, work in healthcare industry, and have questions about how effective the vaccines are in stopping transmission, whether they are safe to take during pregnancy or if they affect fertility. A far safer and more democratic approach to addressing vaccine hesitancy and therefore increasing voluntary vaccine uptake lies in better education, addressing specific and often legitimate concerns that people may hold, and promoting genuine informed consent. It does not lie in censoring differing opinions or removing rights and civil liberties that are fundamental in a democratic society. It certainly does not lie in the use of highly coercive, undemocratic, and unethical mandates. And then he goes on to say this, which I think is classic. He says, the statements by politicians that those who are not vaccinated are a threat to public health and should be locked out of society and denied the ability to work are not measures to protect public health. They are not about public health and not justified because they do not address the actual risk of COVID. These measures can only be about punishing those who choose not to be vaccinated. If the purpose of the health authorities is genuinely to reduce the spread of COVID, there is no basis for locking people out, people who have COVID. And they said, for locking people out, and they said, if you want to test this, you can easily test it by doing a rapid antigen test. He said, conversely, a vaccinated person who contract COVID should be required to isolate until such time as they recover. What we have, because I thought that was significant, so I wanted to read it. What we have in these countries, and I can speak for St. Vincent because I live here, is that powerful political authorities, mainly the prime ministers, jump on their high horses and decided they're going to dictate and arrogate to people. What is significant, however, while they are all calling on people to take a vaccine, which one use in acceptance in a kind of hasty fashion, none of them, not the CDC, not the FDA, not the governments of the Caribbean, none of them are willing to say, all right, we are calling on you to take the vaccine, but if you get injured, you can be sure that this government will take care of you. None of them are saying that. And that compounds the hesitancy on behalf of people. Because if you'll be asking me or anyone else to take a vaccine, or you're mandating that, and you don't want to give a guarantee regarding safety or compensation to take liability for it, a lot of people are going to push back. And that is why they feel compelled to do these mandatory, these mandates.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cassel, I'm going to come back to you on that point around vaccination and content. But first, I just want to invite Mr. Denney, because I know Barbados, the Prime Minister of Barbados does not fall into that category that Mr. Thomas mentioned, preferring states to do a little bit of for population. So you do not really have numbers going there. Is that a factor of your culture, or was there great social activism that caused your opponents to be a little bit more restrained in how they exercise their power? I'm going to ask our panelists to make sure the mics are mute, because I am hearing it from that.
What I would like to say to you is that our movement, we are totally against mandatory vaccine, and we do not support any form, of that will force the people to take vaccinations, because the people also have certain rights. The trade union movement in Barbados spoke out very heavily, against this form of practice. Private sector want to force the government of Barbados to create the conditions for all workers to take the vaccines. But what the government of Barbados have done, they have created well, they haven't been implemented as yet, but they have created a position where they're saying that there will be safe spaces in Barbados for us to be able to create the conditions for, if you want to participate in those safe spaces, then you will have to be vaccinated. So that's the proposal by the government of Barbados. But I think the main issue here is, as a social activist, is that some people are concerned about some of the vaccines that are coming from first world countries. And not that they're saying that they are bad, but you know, when you get involved in mass production of these kind of vaccines and medication and so forth, sometimes you create serious problems. And I think that's the fear that most people in Barbados have in relation to these kind of vaccinations coming from first world countries, especially the United States of America. And many people are saying to us, look, we would like our government to engage Cuba and for us to be able to receive the Cuban vaccines in Barbados, because they know that the Cuban vaccines is not about profit making. The Cuban vaccines is about saving lives and creating the conditions for better health conditions within our countries. And I think that's what the main reason why we have so many Cuban medical persons in our region to help us to create better medical conditions during this period with the COVID-19 situation. So I think Caribbean governments have to work towards biting the bullet and accept the Cuban vaccines. Right now, Cuba have vaccinated close to 90% of its population that can receive vaccination. And Cuba will open up during the month of November to international tourism. And that is because of the popular education program in Cuba. That is because of the type of vaccine that was developed in Cuba, where the people have confidence in it. And if we really want to deal with some of these issues, we have to engage Cuba, because we are engaging multinational and transnational corporations that their main objective is to make money. And to make money, sometimes these institutions forget the whole question in terms of saving lives and just put their products, out there, and then create problems for the people. And then we have a next crisis in Barbados, where the private sector in Barbados were organizing to buy vaccines from Indian, and then the Indian companies say that they do not deal with private sector agencies or third parties. They only deal with government as it relates to the vaccines for the COVID-19 situation. So it tells me that there's some level of corruption, there's some level of dishonesty in relation to this whole question in relation to dealing with giving our people vaccines that may not be recognized or safe. So the people have a lot of questions, and we have to respect that. Well, I'm in agreement with it in terms of encouraging and educating people that we must do something, we must take vaccines. But I think the best vaccine for Caribbean people right now is the Cuban vaccines.
Okay, David Denney, that statement is very definitive. I know a lot of Antiguans who may agree with that, but certainly some who may not. We have some questions come out viewers, we go to them. I just would like, excuse me, to hear from Mr. Alexander, particularly on this question of mandatory vaccination. Like I said, in Antigua, we allowed 2 exceptions, medical exemptions and religious exemptions. But the Rastafarian community in my country have been very agitated by this, because although there has been a carve out for a religious exemption, a lot of the complaints I hear is around the process. So there is a form that you have to fill. You must be credentialed, almost, so to speak. So one of the known Rastafarian communities would have to vouch for your Rastafarianism and declare you a Rasta in order for you to qualify. And most egregious to that community is the fact that the application is submitted to the Ecclesiastical Affairs Board. And there are many in that community who feel that that particular board or association is not equipped to understand or to judge or to oversee their religion and their practices to make any pronouncements on who is Rastafarian or not. I don't think St. Lucia has a mandatory situation, but I would like to invite your views on that, Alexander.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Well, of recent times, the private sector seems to be pushing that agenda for mandatory vaccination of their workers. And recently also, we have a few persons who have actually lost their jobs for refusing to take the job. Now, we are in a situation whereby we are facing medical segregation. We went through racial segregation back in the days when all the civil rights leaders were standing up against racial segregation. And now we are in a state of medical segregation. The unvaccinated have been ostracized from society, and society is going the wrong way. And those leaders who are sitting on their high horses and behaving in that way and mandating vaccination on people and succumbing to the pressures of the private sector, they are in for trouble, because in a democracy, and some of the world's biggest democracies, when you have situations of uprising, of rebellion, and so on, and people, civil unrest and so on, these bigger countries have an army where they could use their army to suppress the people. But these smaller Caribbean islands, we don't have that. So they talk about democracy, and people have rights and so on and so forth. But when people start standing up for their rights, what are they going to do? In St. Lucia, we have a situation where now is 20% of the population vaccinated. So over 80% of the population is unvaccinated. So if those persons decide to rise up, who's going to stop them? So the governments of the Caribbean must be very careful in how they tread in, and even the business houses, because when you have a situation where 20% of the population is vaccinated, and you as a business owner will say only vaccinated people are allowed into your business places, how much business will you generate from that 20% of the population who's vaccinated? Does that really make business sense? But I guess the feeling is that if they go down that road and insisting that only vaccinated patrons can come in, like in the restaurant sector here in St. Lucia recently, that has been the pronouncements, only vaccinated persons are allowed to dine in. So I'm saying, how much business can you generate from a 20% population who's vaccinated? So it makes no business sense. You know, we have situations where in restaurants you have smoking and non-smoking areas. Why not have it that way and accommodate the people? Do not ostracize the people who are unvaccinated. You know, we have situations whereby even the government here and some of the recent pronouncements by the Prime Minister, you know, people are saying, well, you know, this is madness. Because as my good brother, I think Brother Thomas from St. Vincent read from and some excerpts from a ruling in Australia, and it states quite clearly a vast majority of the people who are hesitant towards the vaccine are well-educated people. So there is science on both sides of this argument. There are scientists and doctors on both sides of this argument. So when it is said you follow the science, the question becomes, which science do you follow? Do you follow the science of the narrative that says vaccines are the way to go, or the science that tells you, look, there is a situation of natural immunity. Persons who have had COVID, now they have the antibodies to fight COVID. And if they do take the vaccine, now they have the natural immunity. It could even affect them adversely, even greater. So, you know, there is science on both sides of this argument, but our leaders fail to look and embrace all the science. The only science they want to embrace is the science that says vaccines are the way to go. But there is science to support ivermectin, there is science to support natural immunity, there is science to support the use of vitamins D and zinc and vitamin C. There are all these things out there, but the narrative is vaccine, vaccine, vaccine. And I see trouble for our Caribbean leaders who are going down that road of succumbing to pressure of the private sector and succumbing to their overreach, where they want to make vaccines mandatory on the people. This is going to cause some serious problems on the Rastafari community, although it is said when it comes to religious exemptions, we are right there to get the religious exemption. But let me make it absolutely clear. We will stand with the people. We will stand with the people whether or not Rastafari people are given exemption because of their religious purposes. We're going to stand up with the vast majority of the people who are saying, look, let us look at other tools, other options to fight this COVID. COVID is the enemy. It is not the vaccinated. It is not the unvaccinated. COVID is the enemy, and we must use all the tools in our toolbox to fight this enemy. I heard when Dr. Ralph spoke about get body bags ready and refrigeration, I was appalled by that statement. When I'm saying we have not used all the tools in our toolbox to fight this pandemic, and the narrative that they've been pushing from one, how this is such a threat to people are dying, you know, all the time. Even in St. Lucia, we see a drastic decline in the rate of infections when it comes to COVID. So what is contributing towards the decline in the numbers we're seeing right now? We came from a situation where we had over 2,500 active cases. Now we had 463 active cases. So what is contributing towards that? It cannot be just the vaccine. Only 20% of the population is vaccinated. So there are other factors that is playing into this whole thing. And it is under the medical fraternity and the politicians, they refuse to acknowledge that there are other things that are fighting COVID, and the vaccine is not the panacea. And countries that go down that road, especially Caribbean countries, mandating vaccine on people and causing people to lose their jobs. This is a ticking time bomb. This is a volcano that is bubbling up, and it's going to erupt. And if that volcano erupts in your house or in your country, then you know the whole house is going to go up and the whole country is going to go up. So we have to be very careful with this thing. And the Rasta community stands with the people, whether or not we get this whole exemption for our religious purposes. We stand with the people.
Thank you, Alexander. I have to invite our public into this discussion because we have some comments and questions coming fast and furious at us. We have DN, who is saying that it's just all about control. Do as I say or go home and die until we take away your homes from you as well. And then DN also said that all the governments of the Caribbean are signatories to the Nuremberg Code. And he's asking, he or she's asking, have those governments that have mandated vaccination contravened the Nuremberg Code? I've heard this discussion a lot. Attorney on panel, would you like to answer that question for DN? Have our governments contravened the Nuremberg Code?
Well, I think they definitely have, because what we have is emergency authorized use of these vaccines. And the Nuremberg Code Section 6 says precisely that it is improper for governments or any institution of power to force anyone to take an experimental vaccine or to take any experimental drug. And that is where you have, where if it is experimental, there's this whole right to life, right to try movement, which says once you have the informed consent of the person, you can go ahead and try if that may help the person to come back, to rehabilitate, to get well again from a seriously infectious disease. But the Nuremberg Code clearly warns against the experimental use of vaccines on people. I happened to listen to Senior Counsel Tony Astafan, and Tony Astafan, in his explanation, said, well, what the governments are doing are totally and completely in opposite to what the Nuremberg Code speaks about. He says the Nuremberg Code was intended to look at the Nazis and what the Nazis did. What he forgot is what the codes came into being after the vanquishing of the Nazis. It was to ensure that never again should these experimental vaccines be taken. And where you have emergency use authorization, and in fact, I was looking at a video 2 weekends ago with this scientist Roger Malone, who is credited with inventing the mRNA gene therapy, and he's not opposed to vaccines. He was instrumental in developing the the mumps, measles, and rubella (MMR) vaccine. But what he was saying, which I thought was a very critically important point for a man who has spent most of his adult life in science and scientific development, he says, when we started with these vaccines, we were told that they had an efficacy of upwards of 90%. And now we know that these vaccines, the efficacy have fallen off tremendously. And in one study I saw coming out of Israel, they were down to as low as 39%. He says if the efficacy fell off so drastically in 8 months, how can we vouch for the safety of these vaccines? And I thought that was a critically important point. So this whole notion about the government's moving, not doing what the commitment is, but it's not even not only the Nuremberg Code, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, I think is Section 7, also speaks against governments doing these things, which are an affront to people's rights, which are an affront to people, unless we have informed consent, unless we have an uptake based on knowledge, then these are going to be an affront. So on fundamental international human rights questions, these governments are moving against people and they're moving in an improper way. So I think clearly the Nuremberg codes are implicated, but other human rights international standards as well.
Mr. Cassell, I'd like your view on the issue of the Nuremberg Code, and then I have a question for you from one of our viewers. I'm sorry, I'm inviting our panelists to mute your mic if you're not speaking. I'm sorry, Mr.
Yes,
I
quite agree with what my colleague has just indicated as far as the Nuremberg Code. I don't think I'm able to even add to that. What I want to say, though, is that one of the things that we have not explored was the rationale for the mandatory vaccine, especially when it is apparently unreasonable and it's totally irrational. Because the very persons who are the first point of contact, and that is nurses, medical personnel at the hospital, they are exempted from being vaccinated. That is totally rational.
Thank you.
Secondly, there is the exemptions, the religious exemptions. For example, there's a situation where there's a financial institution on Antigua, and they have barred an employee from attending work because she's not vaccinated. Yet, in the same breath, another employee who happens to be a Rastafarian is exempted. And it's a frontline worker, comes in contact with the other workers who may be vaccinated. So what is the rationale? We have no proper data. We have no data, for example, where stating that the vaccinated persons are less likely to transmit COVID amongst each other. We have none of that. So when you add that up with the fact that there's a prejudicial effect which confers differential treatment on vaccinated than vaccinated, coupled with the point I made about the frontline workers being exempted, is it really about curbing the spread of the disease? It cannot be. It cannot be about curbing the spread of the disease. There seems to be an agenda that we need to reach this number so that we can have what they have termed herd immunity, which we are seeing now in other countries, notwithstanding that they have reached that number, the spread, it's an outbreak of COVID. So I don't understand. It seems as if that common sense has committed suicide in this era, right? So, sometimes I'm wondering if I'm dreaming.
So, Mr. Cassell, we are going to get in because each of you actually touched on the whole issue of vaccine passports, and we're going to go there next. But we're going to field a question here from Suzette Belinsky, and she's taking us back to a point that Mr. Thomas raised earlier that I did tell you, Cassell, I was coming to you. And she says, Suzette Belinsky says, data shows that 438,441 reports of adverse events from all age groups following COVID vaccines, including 9,048 deaths and 41,015 serious injuries. And she gives the period of these deaths, injuries, and adverse events. And she gives the period as being between the 14th of December of last year to July of this year, which is ostensibly 7 months. In 7 months, Suzette Belinsky is claiming, and I've seen similar figures, that there's been over 400,000 reports of adverse events. Mr. Thomas, in his earlier presentation, spoke about the fact that he does not support the mandatory vaccination, particularly because governments are not willing to vouch for them by indemnifying persons who may be injured. What are the legal ramifications of that, Mr. Cassell? I would like to start with you. If I am injured from taking a vaccine, particularly if it is mandated by the government or by my employer, is there any legal recourse whatsoever?
Well, there may be, but it depends. I know sometimes people are asked to sign documents, and it all depends in terms of whether or not they have signed something where they have agreed that they perhaps will not take any legal action. But apart from that, generally speaking, there is a legal recourse that one can take. The question is whether that person will be successful. It's very subjective. There's no pigeonholing whether or not somebody will be successful if they bring an action. However, notwithstanding that, you cannot, no matter what legal recourse you take, you cannot bring somebody back from the dead. And it's hard to even tell a person would prefer have their family member with them than to have $1 million. It is just not the same thing, right? Furthermore, we hear about underlying issues, like maybe asthma, lupus, or whatever it is. There is no exhaustive list that has been presented so that I can say, well, perhaps I should not take the vaccine because
the contraindications. Yes, the contraindications.
People are being educated. We have not been hearing on the radio in all the efforts to promote the vaccine. We have not been hearing, well, this is the reason why you shouldn't take the vaccine. There's some persons who say, listen, I have this issue, my doctor says I shouldn't take it. And they say, that's why you should take it, because you have that issue to protect yourself. And lately, we've heard of persons who are fully vaccinated and have died. There's so many unanswered questions, and sometimes if we get the information, perhaps persons will be more willing to listen, take the vaccine, but they need the information. There are questions that are left unanswered. If we look at the number of deaths that has occurred in Antigua, it's not something to be that I think we should be alarmed about. the recovery rate is 90 something, 98%, or a little higher than 98%, I understand. The recovery rate. Persons have, I know an entire family who contracted COVID, including husband and wife, a 13-year-old daughter, a 10-year-old daughter, and a 5-year-old son, and they were fine within a few days. Drank a little fever grass, they were taking turmeric supplements, elderberry. There's so many other measures that we can take to naturally boost your immune system. But it seems as if persons are looking towards vaccine as like the holy grail. Once you take this, that is it. You are perfect. You are fine. But this is not the case. There are persons who have dropped dead within hours of taking the vaccine.
Mr. Cassell, I mean, I want us to go to vaccine passports, and we have questions from our listeners, but just as a follow-up on what you said, all of this has legal implications, must, in terms of determining the reasonability of the mandate. One, if there are alternative measures that can be taken, then the mandates cannot be deemed reasonable. Yet, in a number of courts where this question has been tested, including the Australian case that Mr. Thomas read, the courts have ruled in favor of mandatory vaccinations. We are all in the region by now familiar with the opinion issued by two illustrious lawyers or judges, right? Sir Charles Michael Dennis Byron and Bell Antoine. And even in their assessment, they would have encouraged, I think many governments are using, at least our two governments, this opinion to legitimize the mandatory vaccine. Why are these cases failing in court? Well, I know that in the region, let me put a caveat. I know that in our region, they have not been properly tested, but there have been cases coming out of the US and certainly Australia and in certain parts of Europe. Why are they failing?
With all respect to these jurisdictions, bear in mind, we should be sucking from the breast of Australia with respect, or even the US. We develop our own jurisprudence. There are brilliant judges on the CCJ and on the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal. I have an issue regarding that opinion. That's what it is. Regardless whether or not, with due respect to him, great jurist, Justice Byron, it's an opinion, and lawyers differ in opinion. You can find 10 other lawyers that can refute every single thing that he would have said in his opinion, and that was what it is. It remains an opinion. And bear in mind, what I have with it, I'm not even sure if an opinion should have been sought from Sir Dennis Byron, because this is a judge that is well respected by other judges and may be influenced by his opinion when in fact the matter comes before. So I have an issue with that. I don't think for the kind of caliber of jurist he is, and given his influence and perhaps younger judges who are still sitting on the Eastern Caribbean High Court or sitting at the Court of Appeal, and perhaps it should not have been leaked because it did say confidential opinion. I'm not sure how it got out, but then again, it is.
Do we have any panelists wanting to jump in on this question before we move to talk about vaccines passports?
I'm sorry?
I was asking the panelists.
I think my colleague is making a very important point. Dennis Byron is a celebrated Caribbean jurist. He has served with distinction on the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal. He was the Chief Justice, and then he went over to the Caribbean Court of Justice, and even went to the Rwanda Genocide Tribunal and did very important work. So for him to be, and it is even worse if he's being paid to do that opinion, and then to have it published. But I agree that we have very good jurists who can make good law. But I think the way in which the law is developing now, people have been pulling opinions from across the world to try to buffet their own arguments. And an Australian opinion is an opinion that's given a fair amount of credence because Australia is part of the Commonwealth. And if you look at some of the cases, a lot of time they're pulling cases from Australia. I don't give as much credence to cases that come out of the United States. But as I said, there's that kind of cross-fertilization now which allowing for the cases to come to fore. I do believe, though, that the way in which we are going is that the cases would have to be tested. We had three matters so far. We had the Antiguan case. We had the case where Justice Lincoln Corbin in the Antiguan case, the matter was on the whole question of injunctive relief. That was blocked on procedural points. In Guyana, Justice Lincoln Corbin again blocked injunctive relief. And in Barbados, rather surprising decision, I thought, the court there blocked not only injunctive relief, but also did not allow for judicial review of the government's actions. But this is still early times yet. And I'm really hoping that a case will come out from, let's say, a place like England because of the authority that it would bring. But at the same time, in the Caribbean, we have to do what we can do. I know that here in St. Vincent, we are actively working and putting a case together that challenges the constitutionality of a lot of what has been happening here.
Can I just say
Well, if I could jump in at this point.
Oh, Era, okay, I'm going to come to you,
Yes,
Mr. Alexander. Just let Mr. Cassell come back, and then we go right to you.
Can I say, in relation to the matter in Antigua, the courts have not even explored the issue on the merits as yet. They solely prevented the granting of leave to file for administrative order based on the party alone as to what the issue of whether or not the party can sue in its name, which is a trade union. That was the very narrow point they have not even begun to explore. And I have reason to believe that the fat lady has not taken the mic as yet. It's not over. And right now, as we speak, fresh matter was filed today as it relates to a group of persons who are challenging the mandatory vaccination on several grounds, including the fact that it has not had it had procedurally, in accordance with Section 176 of the Public Health Act, the requirements were not satisfied. Therefore, they're not valid.
Yes.
So we wait to see. We will see the outcome of that.
Thank you for that. I noticed as well that a lot of these are procedurally being challenged, but not the substance in terms of whether or not the mandates meet the 3-point threshold as of necessity, reasonableness, and proportionality. But Mr. Alexander, thank you for holding. The floor is yours.
Yes, I would just want to say, from an activist point of view, we look at things on a level where we know there's big money rolling in this thing, And as my good brother from Barbados alluded to earlier, this is a multi-billion or trillion-dollar industry, big pharma. So there's a lot of money rolling in this thing, And a lot of people stand, and we heard not too long ago, those companies making those vaccines, they've reported their profits and so on of trillions of dollars. So we as activists, there is a saying that we always chant and we always say, in the marketplace of selling souls, the buyer is in control. So this is an octopus of a system that is spreading its tentacles in all different areas. And when you look at the science that's coming out, even for the vaccine, you have to ask yourself, who pays for that science? Because you pay for what you get. And the people who are funding those experiments with the vaccines and so on, and coming and reporting about the efficacy and so on, if you pay for something, you're going to get it. All these international organizations, the FDA, the WHO, the CDC, all these organizations have been compromised to the extent that some of the directors and the people making decisions within those bodies, when you look behind the scenes and you see the people who are funding those persons, you will begin to understand what is going on in this place, So even judges and magistrates and all these things, a lot of these people are on the take, and I speak very bluntly, and who vex lose. But from a perspective of an activist and looking at our history, where we're coming from, Remember, there was always the situation, like Malcolm X said, the situation of the field Negro and the house Negro. So we still have these things in our society, you know. And Malcolm X said to us, they will use one of us to mislead us or to kill us just to say it was one of us. So we have to look at this thing on a broad scale and look behind the scenes of what is happening with Big Pharma and all the trillions of dollars that is being pumped to people and doctors to portray a certain narrative. And you know, the only thing that could stand up against those things is truth. And even now in our society, people are so used to lies. People are so used to being lied to that when they hear the truth, you know, it's an affront to them. So we have to be very blunt in what's going on there. And we know that there is an agenda, and we know what is going on. Even some of the funders of the WHO, men like Bill Gates, who's on record from since 2015 and 2010, talking about depopulation. And these are the guys pushing the vaccine mandate, and they have their agenda. So these things have been well choreographed. That is why people and activists will tell you this is a plandemic. This is not a pandemic, it's a plandemic. So we know these things are happening behind the scenes. So we have to look behind the scenes to see the big money that is rolling to cause people's opinions to change and people to come and say certain things because they have been paid to do that. So we have to realize that this is not a simple matter, you know. People are going to lose their lives. Activists, you know, we saw our civil rights leaders standing against racial segregation. Right now, activists are standing against medical segregation. And like Brother Bob said to us, many more will have to suffer and many more will have to die, unfortunately, because what is going on there, it's an attack on humanity, and we have to rise up and meet that challenge and expose the lies and expose the misinformation, and the media houses are pushing this thing. They are on the take as well. Judges on the take, WHO, FDA, they're all on the take right now because Big Pharma have the trillions of dollars pushing this thing into them. So I like to speak bluntly, and there is evidence of those things. These things are well documented. So who's funding the WHO? Who are the directors of the FDA? Some of them are also directors in Pfizer and Moderna and all these things. It's almost as if you have doctors who are on the board of directors of funeral homes. This is well documented, you know. When a doctor is a director of a funeral home, the man needs business to stay in business. So he sends certain quota of bodies to that funeral home ever so often. So we have to be very blunt about this thing, and I like to keep it real.
Mr. Alexander, you have kept it very real and very blunt. And I think now is a perfect time for me to remind our audience that the Democratic National Alliance hosts these national consultations on COVID-19 as a public service. It is intended to provide robust discussion and stimulate dialogue. The statements should not be interpreted as representing DNA policy. And likewise, the views and opinions expressed by our panelists are those of the speakers and do not represent the views of the DNA. And we have a very hot and fiery Alexander, and so I just needed to remind our viewers of that. Mr. Denney, the next question is going to go to you, but I think we need to give some room to our viewers. We have Crystal Charlie, and she says, thank you for this forum. We are receiving very important information. And she goes on to say that it's very sad when someone loses their job because they don't support vaccination. Craig Joseph, however, is asking, can any of the panelists confirm whether or not Caribbean islands are enrolled in the CDC vaccination program as a provider? I don't know if our panelists can answer that. The question is, are any Caribbean islands enrolled in CDC vaccination program as a provider? Do any of you have the answer to that question? Or can I go on?
I don't.
Right. Right. We have Margie Hoffman. I think this is a comment based on what Mr. Denney had said earlier. She says Cuba does not have excess vaccines to give away. They are under an embargo and they will vaccinate their population first. I don't have.
Can I speak? Yeah, can I address this, sir?
Sure.
Well, Cuba openly said to the Caribbean region, and when they address also United Nations, they say that the vaccines that are there are for developing countries and poor nations. Right now, Cuba have offered a vaccination program to Argentina, to Mexico, to Iran, and to Vietnam. Cuba is a Caribbean nation, and we should be happy to know that a Caribbean nation was able to develop this kind of medication that can help our people.
But Mr. Denney, I'm going to intrude because I guess the question is, even if the Cuban vaccine is preferable, I know that Cuba went through several other stages of trials. But the fact remains, and our governments continue to say the best vaccine is the one you have now. And so the mandates are rolling with or without the Cuban vaccine. And is it then realistic for governments to wait until the Cuban vaccine is made available? What is your opinion on that?
The Cuban vaccine is available, but our problem is that Caribbean nations are waiting on the World Health Organization to give them the go-ahead or to approve.
Well, it's been approved. Two of them have been approved by
the Cuban vaccination are in some developing nations.
Okay.
And I'm saying that we should be happy to know that one of our Caribbean nations was able to develop a vaccination not on the basis of making profits, but on the basis of helping us with our medical problems and saving lives in our region. Cuba have opened up its arms to the Caribbean region. It have opened up its arms to poor nations from addressing the United Nations General Assembly. And it's for us now to take up that opportunity. Just like Cuba has saying, Barbados have over 100 medical workers from Cuba at this present moment, helping us to save Barbadian people from dying. And there's no other country in the world that have organized that kind of international solidarity for free. So I'm saying, let us move towards the Cuban vaccination, because we know that when you are dealing with these multinational and transnational corporations, and the brother from St. Lucia, he explained it, you know that we will have serious problems. I'm not saying that the vaccination would not be a high standard for first world nations, but when they're dealing with third world countries, okay, most of the time there are serious problems and serious issues because they want to control us. And we don't know what the plan is in terms of feeding our people with, in terms of giving us vaccines that may not be of.
That's a trust issue.
And that's why so many people in the region are very concerned. Not only the Rastafari community and religious persons, but there are people who are educated, and we saw what many of these countries have done with African nations when it comes to dealing with the whole question, of giving the African children and the African people vaccines. We saw what they have done to many African states. So it's not like we don't have the evidence and there's no history about these things. Okay, so I think that Cuba have offered a new path, and we should accept it.
Thank you. So Mr. Denney is advocating for the Cuban vaccines all the way on the issue of trust, commonality, and of course, the legacy of cooperation amongst us. So let us move now. We have about 15 minutes left in our program. And so I just want us to spend a little time talking about these vaccine passports. The vaccine passports are now offshoot to a greater of manual vaccinations. However, they are being used as a tool in countries where vaccinations have not been mandated. I think it was said earlier by one of the panelists that this has moved from being simply a public health issue, where the measures and the powers and the approaches of governments are not simply public health based, but it is now an issue of trying to push persons to be vaccinated. So let me ask our lawyers first. Vaccine passport, that is denying a person service or resources. And in some places, I hear people can't even access their pension unless they are vaccinated. Is that legal? Is that legal in the public sector in terms of public services, access to public services? And is it legal in the private realm if a business owner determines who they will let have access based on their vaccination status? Is medical privacy still a thing? Any of the lawyers can go first.
Well, clearly, the issue of medical privacy is out the door. I mean, here in St. Vincent, we now know that public workers have to, if they're looking for any kind of exemptions, must submit their medical records to the chief medical officer, or you have to submit your medical records to your supervisor at your job. So there are real pressures on people's right to privacy. But as it relates to the passports, governments are going headlong. We see them in Israel, we see them in Europe, in Italy, and Greece, and increasingly we see them now. I think the country in the Caribbean that's most furthest along with that is Trinidad and Tobago, where you have to have passports to go into restaurants, to go into theaters, and so on, malls, and so on and so forth. From where I sit, I think that these passports are immoral, they are unethical, and they are fundamentally illegal. And I can't wait for some case to get to the court on the substantive point, because I think they are unreasonable. I think they are discriminatory. I think that they are disproportionate. And all of these are fundamental tenets of law.
Yeah.
All too often, you hear governments, whether it's Prime Minister Brown or Prime Minister Gonzalez or Prime Minister Ali in Guyana, saying, well, fundamental rights are not absolute. Of course, they're not absolute. But their responses are, oh, we are doing what is reasonable.
Yeah.
But as my colleague would tell you,
Oh, I think we have lost Mr. Thomas.
not, you are going to have a situation where people, you can't simply say reasonable. As our colleague said earlier, it is what is reasonably required. What is reasonably required in a democratic society. And no one can tell me that any judge who is sitting and looking at this current reality would say that someone should be locked out, should be starved to death, should lose his or her job simply because they opt not to take a vaccine. I don't see how that is proportionate to the threat that is confronting us. And I really, really hope that one of these matters get to court on the substantive issue soon so that some court can make a ruling.
Mr. Cassell, vaccine passports.
Vaccine passports are a violation of breach of confidence, certainly. Traditionally, we could not ask somebody, are you HIV positive? I mean, when people ask me whether I'm vaccinated or not, without answering, I ask them who was the last person that they had sex with, and they are outraged. I said, well, that's the very same thing. You can't ask me that, right? I mean, it's not, but it has become the norm for your health information to be displayed out there by ministers of government. We have seen it, where ministers of government will.
Let me interrupt you, Cassell, just so you can. Because the whole idea is that this is a contagion that is spread as a virus would, right, by air and by droplets, and so it is very easy for the virus to pass from one person or the other. The whole idea of you being vaccinated to protect other people in the society, you can factor in that into your answer for me. Some people don't like that analogy of HIV because you can't get HIV from sharing, a burger with me. Go ahead.
Fair enough. However, okay, if that's the way to spread, we have seen that perhaps this has been curbed by taking the simple of wearing a face mask, for example, of sanitizing regularly. Persons have had persons' hands consumed more alcohol than their mouths, than they themselves. Because everywhere we go, we're washing our hands, we're sanitizing our hands. These are measures that can be taken. And if only we adhere to them, people continue to wear their mask. Of course, we will see that the disease is under control. For 3 months, Montreal was COVID-free, and then they had 1 or 2 cases. Then shortly after that, they became COVID-free again for about 4 months. And that's because they have been taking necessary steps to curb this. It is not necessary for somebody to take the vaccine. Matthew, I believe in freedom of choice. If you want to take the vaccine, fine. I'm not against the vaccines. But what I'm saying is that people should not be forced to do so. There are measures that businesses can take. For example, allow the person to work from there are persons who have been working from home for months. Now, there are some persons who, by nature, because of the nature of their job, cannot work from home. But those who can, they should be allowed to, so that the vaccination will be a last resort.
Can the government tell me, Mr. Cassell, that I can't renew my license or I can't access the court or maybe very soon the police station if I am not vaccinated? I have to present a vaccine card to enter a bar or a restaurant. This is where we're actually there.
That is outrageous. Imagine that if you're charged with a criminal offense and you have decided not to take the vaccine, how are you going to, well, now in the High Court we're using Zoom, but let's suppose that we're in the magistrate's court, but they're not permitting hearing by Zoom, not in the perhaps in the family court there, not in the other court. Antigua, what happens? I mean, can you then be in breach of the bail condition to return to court and if the occasion that it is adjourned because you decide not to take the vaccine and saying you cannot come into it? Listen, what we're seeing is chaos in the making.
Yes. So we are 5 minutes away from end time, and so I will allow Mr. Denney and Mr. Alexander to comment on this issue of vaccine passports. I know this will not be our last engagement discussing constitutional rights and freedoms because there are many things to unpack. But Mr. Denney, vaccine passports. You mentioned earlier your government speaking about safe spaces. I guess that is a little a more chlorinated way of saying vaccine passports. Tell us about your safe spaces in Barbados. Mr. Denney, are you hearing?
Oh, yeah, I think the governor want to institute the safe spaces in the at the beginning stages within the medical hospitals and areas where we have the frontline workers as the first stage. Then I think they will move it into the restaurant and hospitality industry. For me, I do not have a problem with the idea of creating safe spaces because Barbados is a country that is dependent on tourism, and it's the only industry that Barbados has. And I don't think a tourist will come to Barbados vaccinated and ready to go into a hotel, and then when he or she goes into the hotel, you have a staff that is not vaccinated. So we either going to develop our industry or we're not going to develop the industry. And
But
I
let
think
me interrupt you, Mr. Denney. Let me interrupt you. Permit me, because I've heard that, and I often say to myself, I find it very ironic because these tourists are coming from places where they do not have vaccine mandates, and in some cases, no vaccine passport, and in other cases, no protocols or restrictions at all. Yet we feel the need in our small islands to be so overly restrictive. Is that a real thing? Is that real that we need to have those safe spaces and these restrictions in order for tourists to come? Where has that been tested?
well, you see, the thing is that if we want the tourism, we have to create those kind of conditions. If not, we have to look in a direction where we are going to create other industries. Okay? And we are not looking in a new direction to create any industry. We still remain dependent on the tourist industry. Now, we are asking the tourists to come to Barbados. We ask the tourists to come to Barbados vaccinated, okay, and with a PCR test, and then they can enter Barbados. So that if the tourists come with these things, then they're expecting that the workers who are working in the hotel industry also have these things. I mean, it's only but fair, okay? So for me, I think that the creating of the conditions for safe spaces is the key. But what government needs to do is to have more discussions and more dialogue with the trade union movement
To get buy-in.
so that to get them to buy into it, so that if you have hotel workers that do not want to take the vaccine, then you need to create the conditions for them to work in other industries so that they can satisfy the needs of their families. And the people who are prepared to take the vaccines can then be given the opportunity to work within the hotel industry. That's my recommendation as a trade unionist. I will not object to the safe spaces, and I will not object to the people who do not want to take the vaccine. I think both of them have legal rights, and I think that we can work together if we coordinate ourselves in a way that we respect all the different views that are out there.
Okay, we're going to go to closing remarks just now once I hear from Mr. Alexander on the issue of vaccine passport. Mr. Alexander, I wonder how you feel about that.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I must say that you see all these ideas, including the vaccine passport, we have to consider put in what you call natural immunity in the mix as well. And if the authorities, the government, the politicians, the health authorities, if they were at least being honest with the people, there is a test called the antibodies test. And this is a test that proves that you've had COVID, you've gone through COVID, and now your body and your immune system have produced the antibodies to fight COVID. So you have natural immunity. The argument has been natural immunity does not last as long as the vaccine. But when you put them, the studies that are coming out of places like Israel is showing otherwise, that the vaccine wanes after about 4 months, and natural immunity lasts about 6 or 9 months. And some doctors are saying, well, natural immunity, when you do the antibodies test and it has been discovered that you have the antibodies, so you've gone through COVID, it is even more hazardous for you to even take that shot, that jab. So you have to wait about 6 to 9 months before you even consider taking the jab. So if people are honest and they say, okay, they give persons the right to have the antibodies test, and you discover that you have the natural immunity, you do have the antibodies, and issue you that passport. Issue you that passport on natural immunity grounds. So you have people who have vaccine immunity because they took the jab, but you also have people with natural immunity. So you will have more buy-in to this kind of a system. But the dishonesty that pervades this whole thing, and trying to perpetuate this big lie about vaccine immunity, and through you, and when you take the vaccine, then you get the vaccine passport that gives you all those privileges, whereas the persons who are unvaccinated, they get discriminated against. They can't do this, they can't go there, they can't go there. This is just creating segregation in the society. And again, as I said earlier, this is like a volcano that is going to erupt in the Caribbean islands. And the governments have to be very careful. So we need to have an honest conversation, bring natural immunity into the mix, so people can all have that passport, which says that they have natural immunity, not vaccine immunity, but natural immunity, and there could be greater buy into that whole aspect of the passport thing. But on the surface there right now, it just boils down to discrimination and ostracizing a certain set of people from society, and that is very dangerous. And earlier I heard my good brother spoke about the AIDS issue, and you jumped in and tried and you put in your own spin to it. But I still think that in much the same way that AIDS patients were discriminated against, this is a similar situation we're going through, and it's just a different time. And as I said earlier again, we had the situation of racial segregation that our civil rights leaders stood up against and the activists stood up against. And in this time, it is no different. Activists will stand up against health segregation going on right now. Because of your health status, you are either given privileges or you are discriminated against. So this is very dangerous, and we need to have an honest conversation about this whole vaccine passport and bring in the natural immunity into the mix.
Thank you, because we're right back where we started. It is hard to stand up, though, in a state of emergency with so many restrictions and social distancing and needing permission, well, not being able to have even public meetings. So this whole idea of social activism in the age of COVID-19 is a topic all by itself. But I wish to thank the four of you for very engaging and stimulating national consultation this evening. And I will invite you, similarly as we start, to just give your brief closing remarks. And I will start, as I have always done, with our two attorneys on deck. Mr. Thomas, I will allow you to go first, your closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Malaka Parker, for inviting me. I want to say that this we are going through very serious times. This is the first time in the history of mankind that we have mass vaccination. This is the first time where we have an attempt to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in society. And in a period where literally all of the governments in the world, literally all of the major institutions in the world, the mass media, all of them essentially have ganged up on the people. And what I can say is that I am quite pleased with the resistance of the people, not only here in the Caribbean, but across the world. I think it augurs well for progress and development and advancement, and we could only encourage this. In whatever field we are in, we encourage it by carrying the message to people, by letting people know that they are not any less of a human being because they said they do not want to be experimented on. As I said, where there's risk, there must be choice. And I don't think, although in the Caribbean we are hearing that nobody has suffered any adverse effects from COVID, the people on the ground in the villages and the towns know that people have suffered, and consequently they're saying, no, they're not going to do this. So I am quite pleased with what is happening, and I hope that that resistance will continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Estelle.
Well, these are unprecedented times. Never before have perhaps any of us lived through a time like this where you're seeing that your liberty has been curtailed. You're seeing that you have to be wondering whether or not you can feed your family because perhaps you and your spouse are in the tourism industry, which is greatly affected, or somebody for you is in the entertainment industry, which has been greatly affected. What we have to do now is to at least challenge and put it on record, get some sort of legal declaration as to what is happening right now. The persons are afraid and persons need to challenge so that at least we can weave the jurisprudential tapestry in the region. And while we have judgments in countries like the US, bear in mind, and even in the UK, bear in mind that we have written constitutions and things may not, we cannot just take a judgment from Australia, even though it might be highly persuasive. It is not necessarily binding on us here in the region. So we just need to ensure that we push to the limits. So we go, this is what a democratic society does. They go to the courts and to seek determination on critical questions. And this should be no different. I've seen people who, because of their choice, they do not want to take the vaccine, and they cried for hours in a long line and took something that was against their conscience. It is heartbreaking, and it is also unfortunate. And the sad thing about it, you cannot unvaccinate. That's the sad thing about it.
Yeah.
For those who are, and this is for those who want to choose to not to take the vaccine. It is sad, but as we say, unless we're gonna become a lawless society, we have to just do the democratic thing and approach the courts and get determination on questions. And in the meanwhile, I don't know. All I can say is pray.
Right, and I like that you're charging us to weave the jurisprudential tapestry. I like that. We have Analia Matthias waving good night to you, Mr. Cassell. So I just want to deliver that message to Nali.
I see her. Good night, Miss Matthias. I see her. Good night.
Yes. Right. Can I welcome now closing remarks from Mr. Denney?
Thanks. I would like to say thanks to you and your organization for giving me the opportunity to participate in this session. My statement would be to explain to you that many Caribbean people and workers are suffering today because of the COVID-19 situation. Many people are unemployed, and I think that the ministries of labor within our region and the trade union movement should work together to do an audit so that we can better understand what is happening among those working class people in our region that are suffering because of the COVID-19 situation. And I think we should work together as Caribbean people to create the conditions for persons to be trained so that they maybe can work in other areas that are now existed during this period. And I think we should do whatever it takes to make sure that Caribbean people can live a basic standard of living so that we can save lives of Caribbean people. And that's my final statement. And I want to say thanks to you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Denney. You didn't say it this time around, but throughout this program, you have indeed been lamenting the need for popular education programs, and I do have that written here. Thank you. I welcome you now, Mr. Alexander, with your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for having me here this evening on this program as a panelist. Brother Thomas, Brother Denney, Brother Warren, thank you all very much for the engagement. I want to send out a warning to Caribbean leaders to listen to their people, listen to what the people are asking for. The people are asking for because they trust the Cuba vaccine. Listen to the voice of the people. If you want to see a serious uptick in vaccinations, listen to what the people are calling. Listen to the science that talks about natural immunity. Listen to the science that talks and warns about the danger of the vaccines. Do not force this upon your people. Stop this discrimination against your people who choose not to take the jab. You're going to create a humanitarian crisis of hunger and starvation and unemployment in the Caribbean islands. Very careful if how you're moving. I believe the Honorable Gaston Brown, your Prime Minister, is the chair of CARICOM. I want to appeal to him to do his job and appeal to the WHO to approve this Cuba vaccine for the people of the Caribbean. We have deep-seated distrust of the European medications, especially this experimental vaccine. We want to stop this inhumane treatment of our people in the Caribbean, and we want Caribbean leaders to listen to the people because, like I said earlier, and I've been saying for this evening, this is like a volcano and this is going to erupt and it's going to be trouble for us. And I want to echo the sentiments of Bob Marley in his song when he said, people need to get up and stand up and fight for their rights, join the resistance. People are very much informed and educated as to what is happening globally, and people are taking a stand. You could fool some people sometimes, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. So the people are seeing the light, and I applaud my people for the resistance. Keep fighting on and stand up for your rights, my people. Blessed love and good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Thank you to our 4 panelists. Thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us in another edition of the Democratic National Alliance's National Consultations on COVID-19. So we encourage you to find us again next Thursday, same time at 7 p.m. and we will go a little deeper into this question, and we will be looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and industrial relations. I know that this is a very hot topic right now. It has been alluded to all in terms of workers being displaced. And so we look forward to you joining us on our panel next week. Good night, Antigua and Barbuda. Good night, region. Good night, the world. Thank you, panelists. Good night, all.
Good night. Good night.